Welcome to the Running Channel. I'm Andy, and together with Anna, we're in the mountains today to talk to you all about altitude training. Throughout my professional career, I was lucky enough to have the chance to train at altitude a fair bit. So I'm here today to hopefully give you some great tips about how altitude can affect your running.
This is my first time in the mountains, so I've got loads of questions that I want to ask you and hopefully get some tips for running out here. First off though, if you're new around here, please do hit the subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you get notified when we upload new videos all about running to the Running Channel. So the first obvious question is, what do we mean when we talk about altitude training?
Yeah, well, the higher you go above sea level, the less oxygen there is. And the less oxygen there is, the harder it is to run, as you'll have noticed. And your body's response to that is to produce the hormone EPO, which everyone might know about through sports doping and Lance Armstrong, because EPO is your body's way of producing more red blood cells. Red blood cells carry oxygen, so more red blood cells means that you can carry more oxygen and you're more efficient when you're at altitude.
So when you've been training and running and living at altitude, then when you return down to sea level, does that mean that you've got more red blood cells so you're able to then run faster?
Exactly, that's the theory behind altitude training, definitely.
Brilliant. And how high are we talking here?
Anywhere from 1,500 metres to 3,000 metres is what people consider the usual kind of range for training at altitude. It needs to be high enough that you get the benefit we've just talked about from a red blood cell perspective, but low enough that you can train fast enough and hard enough without being too exhausted, because once you go above 3,000 metres, you run the risk of altitude sickness and it is much harder to do anything.
So within that range, does it mean the higher the better?
That's where it gets a bit trickier. There's a lot of individual variability when it comes to responding to altitude. It's all based on your genetics. So some people will respond really quickly and see a big benefit from training at altitude within a relatively short period of time. Other people might take a lot longer to see the same response. So it does require a little bit of trial and error if you're going to try and do it properly to maximise the benefits from altitude. But if you are heading out on a holiday or a training camp for a few days or a few weeks, then I think you'll definitely see some benefit. You should just be aware that it will be different from person to person.
And you've obviously got your own experiences of this.
Yeah, I had my own experience. I've trained at Iten in Kenya, which is really high, so that's over 2,500 metres, and also at Mount Laguna in California in the US, which is a bit lower, so around 1,800 metres. And I found that my performance was much better at the lower altitude because I could train that little bit quicker. Whereas in Kenya, I found it was just too high for me. I couldn't recover between runs. I found that I was a bit sluggish. I wasn't able to train fast enough in my hard workouts to get that real benefit. So my recommendation is always to start lower and then you can work up to going a little bit higher.
So if people respond differently then, is there a rule of thumb for how long you should be staying at altitude to feel the benefits?
Yeah, it's variable for different individuals, but the advice is to go for at least 3 weeks, not least to take advantage of the fact that you're going to have to adapt for the first 3 or 4 days when you're training at altitude, so you lose a few days of hard training. So maximising the time at altitude makes sense.
Yeah, and how long afterwards do you feel the benefits of training at altitude?
That's the big question that no one has a specific answer to, but the advice is that it ranges from 3 weeks to 3 months. It's a pretty big window, but the important thing to be aware of is timing relative to a big event or race that you might have planned. So usually athletes think that there's a window of probably 48 hours to 72 hours coming down from altitude where you still feel okay. Then you might experience a week or 10 days of actually feeling a little bit sluggish, so that would be the window to avoid racing or trying to hit any big performances in. And then you start to pick up again and feel the benefits after that time. So timing is really important.
So is there anything that I should expect to experience when I first go running at altitude?
You'll be out of breath. That's the first thing that you'll notice. It's a really obvious one. But also when you go out on runs, you'll find them more difficult and your heart rate will be higher. You'll be breathing more heavily than you would be to run the same pace if you're at home. So it's actually worth the first few days when you get to altitude, keeping it at a relatively easy pace. And if you can, keep an eye on your heart rate on those runs.
And can I do my own sort of normal training at altitude still?
Pretty much, but you should take into account the fact that because you're at altitude, there's less oxygen, you're going to hit your anaerobic threshold more quickly. So that would mean that you might need to think about reducing the paces that you run threshold runs, interval sessions at, or even slightly increasing the recovery overall. In fact, general recovery at altitude is slower, so if you're recovering from sessions or from a slight injury niggle, then you should also take that into account.
So when you're training in the mountains, is there any special diet that you should be thinking about, or changing anything, having anything new?
The first thing you need to think about really is hydration. Being at altitude, you are going to get dehydrated more easily, particularly in the first few days while you're adapting, but actually throughout your stay at altitude. You'll be breathing more heavily, so you will lose more fluid through your breath, but also because it's thinner air, your sweat will evaporate more quickly off your skin without you noticing it, so you can actually lose fluid that way without even realising. So that's really important.
Okay, and then food-wise, is there anything that I should think about or be careful with at all?
Not necessarily any particular dietary requirements, but because you are creating new red blood cells, one of the main components of that is iron. So even if you're not able to get a blood test and find out your iron levels, we're not doctors, but a good rule of thumb is to look at supplementing iron when you're at altitude, potentially with 200 milligrams of ferrous sulfate a day. But it's important not to take that at the same time as dairy or caffeine, so that's milk or your cup of tea in the morning. And actually trying to have it with something like orange juice that's high in vitamin C can help with the absorption of that iron.
Great. So we've come up a little bit higher into the mountains. As you can see, we've had to put our jumpers on because it's a bit chilly. And I want to know all about altitude tents because I've read some stuff about them and I don't really know a lot about them. So how does that work?
Basically, they're either a small tent that you sit on top of your bed that you sleep inside, or some of them are big enough that you can actually put your whole bed inside. Then you go to bed inside the tent. There's a generator that pumps nitrogen-rich air into the tent. And because there's more nitrogen, there's less oxygen, just like being at altitude, so it simulates the altitude, and your body should, in theory, have the same response and produce red blood cells in the same way as it would going to altitude.
So you just sleep in them, you don't that's it, just sleep in them like normal?
Yeah, you might want to use them when you come down from altitude to kind of prolong the benefits, or if you don't have the benefit of being able to train at altitude, then you might use them to simulate that altitude. But broadly, you sleep in them as normal. The problem comes because the recommendation is that you really need to stay inside the tent for prolonged periods of in excess of 12 hours, which can make it impractical to a lot of us. You don't have to be asleep the whole time, but you do have to be inside them the whole time. And the recommendation again is that you don't leave during that 12 hours, even to go to the toilet during the night. In fact, this is where the limitations come in, because some athletes report struggling with fatigue and sluggishness because they never fully acclimatise, because they're constantly cycling in and out of the tent every 10 or 12 hours. They can struggle with dehydration and overall fatigue and not recovering from their training.
Okay, so I've heard about living high and then training low. What's that all about?
Essentially, that's a method for maximising your time spent at altitude. So you can live at between 2,500 and 3,000 metres to try and maximise your exposure from a red blood cell production perspective. And then during the day, to do your training, you drop down to a height that's much closer to sea level to do your higher intensity stuff.
Makes sense. Well, we don't all have the luxury of living somewhere as beautiful as this in the mountains or being able to train at altitude all the time. But hopefully you found some tips there for altitude training. Maybe you've learned something new. Let us know in the comments below if you have. Maybe you've had some experience of altitude training too. We'd love to hear about that as well. So make sure you pop it in the comments below.
And don't forget to subscribe, tap the bell icon so you'll be notified when we upload new videos like this one, which we do every week, and we'll see you next time.